Did you mute everybody? Did you activate the mute?
Let me just...
Oh, okay. Okay, are you good to go?
I'm fine, yep.
Okay, dann I start. Ja, herzlich willkommen heute zu unserem Talk über Innovative Climate Action. Ich bin Rebecca von den Students for Future in Mainz und ich freue mich total, dass wir heute einen Gast aus Schottland haben, Beck aus Edinburgh. Und deshalb wird der Talk auch auf Englisch sein. Ihr könnt aber während des Talks eure Fragen in den Chatbereich schreiben, sowohl auf Englisch als auch auf Deutsch. Dann kann ich die auch übersetzen, wenn ich ihn dann später frage. So yeah, welcome. That was just a short introduction on my side. We will also be streaming this on YouTube. So hello, people on YouTube, I guess. I'm really happy that we have Beck today here, live from Edinburgh, to talk about climate action in Scotland leading up to COP26 as well. So yeah, just enjoy the talk and let's start.
Great, thanks very much, Becky. That's really good of you, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to give you something of a personal picture of actions and my own engagement. So the awakening in me in relation to climate problems and the way in which I've been involved, my own learning, my own reactions to things. And I'd be delighted to speak to you afterwards. So if you've got any questions, please go ahead, or any comments. So essentially what we will be covering is, the way I think of this is there's really three elements. I think climate action has got a very personal component. It's these are things which, for most people, it is strongly held views, and certainly that's the case for me. And I've been influenced a lot by my own reactions to things and my own learning and the way in which I've engaged. So to me, the primary thing, first of all, is shock, understanding, and action. So I'll start with my own first encounter with something that really surprised me, shocked me, and galvanized some action from me. The IPBES, the biodiversity report from the UN, came out and reached the conclusion that there were 1 million species facing extinction. And when I saw that, I thought for the first time, this changes everything for me. I can't carry on as if it's just another issue. This is massive. So at that point, I started spending more time learning and reading. And one of the first things, of course, that I did have a pretty good look at was the IPCC report, which came out in 2014. And that's really, for most people, know that this is where the most robust science is produced. And they came to a conclusion that, I'm just going to move this around, continued emission of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. Now, in a way, we're so used to seeing these sorts of expressions, but there was something in there. Again, it was the word irreversible that concerned me. And I'm still very concerned about things that I keep thinking, seeing, and realize there's no going back. That was 2014. In 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. That was signed by pretty much every country in the world, all nations. We know most recently Donald Trump has pulled out of it, but it was an immense achievement. And the key mitigation commitment that was made there, and was made by all countries around the world, is that they would hold an increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we now are very familiar with these two numbers, 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. In 2018, the IPCC did a detailed analysis of what that means, of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. I think I certainly realized that when I've been speaking to many people, and I will talk in terms of degrees, it doesn't really capture the significance of what's actually involved at 1.5 degrees and at 2 degrees. So this report was very important because it actually looked at the expected impacts around 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees. And the conclusion that they came to is that the global and regional risks associated with 2 degrees rise in the Earth's temperature are substantially worse than 1.5 degrees. Now, that really has put an end to the debate around what the target is for the Paris Agreement, where the Paris Agreement said 2 degrees, but aim for 1.5 degrees. This report, which came out 3 years after the Paris Agreement, clearly showed that there was so much at stake in terms of the number of people who would be affected by heat waves, the amounts of damage that would be done to different parts of the Earth, the Arctic, the coral reefs, that it just was not practical anymore. It was not a sensible target to keep using 2 degrees. So 1.5 degrees really became the scientific target. Now, I was fortunate enough to listen to a talk by one of the lead authors from the IPCC report. And he was doing a presentation, happened to be in the Houses of Parliament in the UK. And he put this slide up, and it really reflects what's been happening with science. Everybody who talks about follow the science, that's a very important thing to do. But science is learning. Science is actually finding out a lot. And if you compare these three graphs, each of these graphs are looking at the same dimensions. They are unique and threatened species. I'm just reading on the left-hand side, extreme weather events, distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, large-scale singular impacts. If you have a look at the top left, you can see that the expectation there between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees look to be comparatively moderate in consequence. Once this was looked at again in detail in the 5th report of the IPCC in 2014, this had shifted very significantly, and most of them were now looking yellow and orange. And when that 2018 1.5 degree report was written, we now see that everything is looking much more dangerous than had previously been assumed. So this was one of the things that really affected the way that I was thinking about things. I've been thinking about the targets that countries are setting. Internationally, a lot of countries have been aiming for 2050, and in the UK, 2050 was set as a target. The IPCC has also referred to 2050 as a target. But when I started looking at this, I started getting some concern because I realized a lot of the targets had been set before these more detailed assessments had been made. I think most people probably will have seen a diagram like this. This is sometimes referred to as a hockey stick diagram, where it's essentially flat and then starts going up quite sharply. And this is a diagram of carbon dioxide emissions. If you have a look, the thing to notice is how sharply it increases from about 1950. From about 1950, it increases at a rate which is very, very much faster than had previously been the case. So just that shape of the emissions is obviously of concern. If we look at temperature being put alongside the emissions, here we see a set of temperatures going back from 1880, going through to 1940, 1960. And then from about 1980, they're all red. Pretty much every year is now hot, and as hot as it's ever been. So if you ever have a chance to take a bet with anybody about next year's temperatures, do bet on it being hotter than the average over the last 100 years. It is so clearly something that's happened, and year by year, we're seeing these targets very close to the hottest year ever. We're now at approximately 1 degree above the average for pre-industrial times. The idea of a carbon budget, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the idea of a carbon budget, but it's, for me, one of the most important ideas. And it's clearly something that people can understand and they can get a sense of. This doesn't have to be a concept in science that is only really available for scientists to understand. The idea of a budget is quite clear. And these lines here reflect a number of studies. On the left-hand side are the confidence interval for 1.5 degrees for various studies. And on the right-hand side, the red lines are confidence intervals for 2 degrees. And these are estimates of how much carbon dioxide can still be consumed and make the 1.5 degree target or the 2 degree target. So in summary, let me just go back to that previous slide. What's important to recognize, and I think whenever we're looking at science, the idea of confidence intervals is very important. So there's quite a wide range across all of these studies. So when somebody says the target is such and such a figure, it really can only be a probabilistic target. It's not something that you can say, oh, we know how much time we've got, we know how much budget remains. These are, there is a range, and the next slide shows what is the best estimate, where the IPCC estimate with 50% confidence that there's 480 gigatons of carbon dioxide remaining. With 66% confidence, we can say, if we limit it to 320 gigatons of carbon dioxide, we can be that much surer. But you can tell by these confidence figures that we don't have a huge amount of confidence around these things. So if we were to use something which was much more severe, much stricter, something like a 95% confidence interval or a 99% confidence interval, we would probably be at a point where we're already committed to 1.5 degrees. So the figures are 480 gigatons and 320 gigatons, which does not correspond to a long period of time. If we look, I'm just going to got this picture on the side of that diagram that I showed a little bit earlier. And the figure that we've got on the right shows annual emissions of approximately 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This study was done in 2018. If we said how many years, if we can't bring our emissions down at all, how many years does that correspond to? It's fairly clear, it's close. On the 1.5 degrees, we're already at a point where we are now have little chance to achieve these figures, even if there was the best and most ambitious actions being taken. So we're talking about something like 8 to 12 years from 2018 before we go through the 1.5 degrees. That's giving ourselves only a 50% chance. And if we look at the 2-degree figures, that is 1,070 to 1,400. And that's about 27 years at the current rate, or possibly even just less than that, up to 35 years. So if you add those numbers, we're talking about around about 2045 to 2050. And these are with 50% chance of meeting these targets if we limit all the carbon dioxide to just these figures. I hope that's reasonably clear. Is it? I don't know if it's worth my while. Does anybody have any questions about what I've just shown? If I don't hear from anybody, I'll just continue on. I think it's fairly clear, but for me, this was part of the learning that I was going through, really having had the shock that there really is something serious happening to nature, to wildlife. The timescales when we start looking at it are clearly not long, and the matter is urgent. So, in conclusion, we need rapid, far-reaching changes on an unprecedented scale to achieve the targets set by the most robust and comprehensive science and agreed by the nations of the world. So that to me gives me some clear position. This is when I think about targets and the way in which we need to be addressing matters, I think it's clear. I think the science is clear, and I think the Paris Agreement is in line with the science. So these two things give us a basis on which to act. Just want to say something about, I grew up in South Africa, and this really shocked me. I'm going between these two threads of shock and learning. And in Cape Town, I think of as being quite a wet city. It has drenching rain, slow rain. When I was there, it used to rain a lot during the wintertime. And I've been away for about 30 years now. And I look back and I see these headlines of Cape Town being so dry. And it was heading to a point where people were having, it's a modern city, 4 million people, people are having to queue up to get water. That was a real shock to me. And the other thing that happened last year was Victoria Falls. Now, I have been to Victoria Falls, which is absolutely majestic, beautiful, natural wonder of the world. I've been there probably 20 years ago. And Victoria Falls are also referred to as Musi Atunya, the smoke that thunders. This was something that was one of the most spectacular views in the world. And it's unspoiled, relatively. I've not been to Niagara, but this is unspoiled. In 2019, as a result of loss of rainfall, this is what it looked like. And I was shocked, and I still look at this photograph and I'm really saddened by it. So again, these things, just to say, as in leading up to the kind of way in which I think of actions, I move between looking at things, finding out about things, and looking around and seeing things which have particular significance to me. I'm very concerned about the issues of countries who are facing tremendous impacts from climate change when they've had no response. They're not responsible at all for what they're facing. That's one of the issues. Okay, so I started getting involved with, I decided I would look for things to be involved with. And in the UK, I'm sure you'll be aware that Extinction Rebellion in 2018, 2019 suddenly captured tremendous amounts of attention and interest. And I wasn't engaged with Extinction Rebellion, although I knew of what they were doing, particularly in London. And I happened to be in Edinburgh and came across a street blockage and happened to recognize somebody in this photograph. And I thought, oh, okay, so this isn't just for real weird people. And I did become engaged with Extinction Rebellion. The way in which they engage, I think you will probably know, is, an approach which is essentially civil disobedience, which involves primarily the actions that have been taken have been blocking streets, but there's a number of other things, and I'll just touch upon some of the other things that they're involved with and other groups are involved with. So here are the demands of Extinction Rebellion. Government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. Working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. Government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And government must create and be led by the decisions of a climate assembly, citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. They're quite simple. Here's an example of another action that these are also people in Edinburgh who, this is both what Extinction Rebellion and others refer to as non-violent direct action, also called civil disobedience. These 5 people locked themselves to the parliament and they gave the keys to 5 political leaders. And I believe that this is actually, they took this as something that had been done elsewhere. But so non-violent direct action is one thing, but political engagement is another aspect of what they were doing. Outreach activities of involving people in festivals, in events, information campaigns. Outreach is a substantial part of what Extinction Rebellion do. And it's an important part of what Extinction Rebellion do in terms of their target. Their target has been to bring on board 3% of the overall population. And the other thing that Extinction Rebellion are very good at is the street theatre. So if you ever go to Extinction Rebellion events, they often will have something like this that's going on. It attracts public attention and it attracts media attention. So street theatre is a big part of what they do. People engage. These red rebels, they pop up all over the place and they walk around silently. There were things about the Extinction Rebellion demand. So I've been a coordinator for Extinction Rebellion outreach for a while, and that's primarily involved with giving talks and engaging with people on the streets, telling people about the climate issues. But coming back to what the demands of Extinction Rebellion are, one of the things I'd been told was that Extinction Rebellion, I was told, is the only game in town. The only game in town, meaning it's the only group who's really being successful in attracting the government's attention, the public's attention. But there was one thing that I had a concern about one of the things I've had a concern about was the target of the demands were on the government. So the first demand, the second demand, and the third demand were all on the government. The government must tell the truth. The government must act now. The government must create a citizens' assembly. And for me, that wasn't and isn't enough of a theory of change for what is needed for climate change. We know that there's other approaches which have been incredibly successful. And just to highlight these things, first of all, Greta Thunberg and the methods that she's been adopting. The primary one, of course, initially was school strikes, but she's such a strong advocate that advocacy is an enormous part of what she does. And her advocacy is really focused on two things as far as I can see. The one is adherence to the science, and the other is a focus on one's own personal footprint. So she's scrupulous about the way in which she uses carbon dioxide. There's been other very, very successful approaches. Litigation, taking court cases have become very successful over the last year. Agenda is a Dutch group. They've taken the Netherlands government to trial. They've raised cases against them and won 3 times in a row. And now the Netherlands government has been forced to cut emissions because they were falling behind with their level of emissions. This is very important, and it sets a precedent. Certainly, I think in Europe and even outside of Europe, many people are looking at the way in which that was done. In the UK, you may know that the Heathrow runway, third runway, has been a major source of dispute for quite some time. And that was taken to trial, and it has also been ruled illegal and not consistent with the Paris Agreement. Very important, the ruling that actions of the government must be compliant with the Paris Agreement is going to be used again in the future. So climate action can take very many forms. In the United States, the Green New Deal has really shifted politics very considerably around a much more progressive approach to climate action. So AOC, Alexia Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders in particular have been leading the way, and it is not just the left wing of the Democratic Party, but it's moved the issue into mainstream democratic policy. And it was included as a full debate. Climate change was a debate for the Democratic candidates. Just looking beyond some of those really high profile climate actions and thinking of it from people in communities and people in communities who are looking to be part of the solution. And this was something that has been a driver for me. I wasn't happy with just making a demand on the government to change, because I don't think even if the government was inclined to change, there's still things that are needed to be done by cities, by people, by communities. In the UK, there's a Declare a Climate Emergency campaign, and I was actually starting to set up a campaign with a couple of other people to encourage councils throughout Scotland to declare a climate emergency. And I had hoped that that would be something that I could encourage a number of councils, not by myself, but through engagement with people throughout Scotland, get the issue of a climate emergency being taken on seriously by groups at a regional level, at a municipal level. As it turns out, it looks like they don't completely need my help. It is happening to a large extent, but there's another issue that's emerged around declaring a climate emergency, and that is that councils declare a climate emergency and then we find they don't really know what to do next. So there is another campaign that's waiting to be done there. So we've had national commitments. The country, the UK has declared a climate emergency. Scotland has declared a climate emergency. City commitments. Edinburgh has declared a climate emergency. Glasgow has declared a climate emergency. And this is being used in many other areas, sectors. I've seen parts of the building community declaring a climate emergency. I've seen a school declare a climate emergency. And I think these are interesting approaches, and they fall somewhere between Greta Thunberg's focus on one's own carbon footprint and a national scale emergency. German Zero, which I'm sure you know about, Becky, in fact, told me about German Zero, and I'm really impressed by what they're doing. And they, again, are taking responsibility. It's not something that they're leaving to the government. German Zero will deliver a 1.5 degree climate action plan and also legislative package. So German Zero is involving leading professionals, which is an interesting enhancement. And this is something which I think is important, to look for partnerships, look to bring people in who can take on substantial projects. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the range of community groups, no doubt you've got exactly the same situation in Germany, in Scotland and in the UK. There are groups like Friends of the Earth, Hope for the Future, Scott E3, and each of them have got incredibly committed people, all achieving a lot, protecting. So Friends of the Earth has been going for 50 years. They're committed to protecting local environment and supporting the adoption of alternative energy. And they have got the ability to undertake their own research and in-depth commentary, which is really helpful. Hope for the Future is providing support for community groups to engage with politicians and to engage with the media. Again, really interesting group who are providing something which will enhance all the work that communities are doing. Scott E3 is a group that was initiated by trade unionists, and their focus is on a just transition. They've taken on a campaign to develop and promote the creation of climate jobs and engaging with the workplace. I only raise this not because there's any particular reason that I wanted to talk about these three groups, but they are important illustration of how wide-ranging these topics are. There's clearly people involved with animal rights, there's people involved with climate mitigation, there are people involved with particular local regions. There's many topics that that different groups are involved with. And I certainly, from my own position, I really keep looking. I try to keep abreast of what people are doing and look for opportunities to partner with these groups when I can. Okay, so moving on to Scotland 2020. It's a really interesting time now to be involved with climate and climate action in Scotland. At this particular point of time, there are many things that are coming together. COP26 will be held in Glasgow. It's been postponed from this year, November this year, to November probably next year. I'm expecting that it's not going to be the first half of next year. COP26 is tremendously important in terms of bringing a focus to climate action. 2020s, from 2020 to 2030, is really the decade of climate action, where so much up till now has been spoken about. Now is the time in Scotland that action will be happening. And in addition, there's a focus which is shifting towards communities playing their part on this change. So if we look at COP26, key things with COP26 is we're going to have world leaders and world media in Scotland, and there'll be a really strong domestic focus on climate change. This particular COP is 5 years after the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is clearly the greatest political achievement to date, and countries around the world made commitments. COP26 is the time, 5 years after Paris, where countries need to come back. It was always envisaged at the time of COP21 in Paris that 5 years later, countries would come back to review the situation, which involves reviewing their own progress, what is facing the world, and look at what the science is saying. And we know that the key issue is to increase climate pledges. The NDC refers to the nationally determined contributions. These are decisions taken by countries, commitments taken by countries regarding what their climate emissions will be going forward. There's a number of campaigns that people are trying to get going around COP26, and there's certainly strong reason for this to be an international set of campaigns. This coming decade, 2020 to 2030, if we look at the targets that are set by Scotland and Edinburgh, these are quite strong targets. 2030, Scotland to reduce emissions by 70%. Scotland's net zero date is 2045. So Scotland will have to take very serious actions immediately now. And Edinburgh has committed to net zero by 2030. So there's immediately a very strong need to define the plan and to get the action started. They've set up a commission, and the commission is looking to set up partnerships. The partnerships really provide opportunities for community groups to engage. For those people who really want to be involved with positive action, the Edinburgh Climate Commission offers a great opportunity. And then just looking at this focus on communities. So there is a context of climate change becoming an important target in Scotland for a couple of reasons. But there's other things that have been happening that put the attention onto communities. The one is climate action is being, communities are being looked at as partners in climate action. So as we've seen from 2019, February 2019 declares climate emergency, through to April 2019, the Scottish Government declares a climate emergency. September 2019, legislation is put in place to make it a binding agreement that 2045 is the target, 70% reduction for Scotland by 2030. That's in place. And this year, just a couple of months back, the Edinburgh Climate Commission was formed, who will be leading the plan and engagement with businesses. The obvious thing is a public sector organization like the council does not have control of all the businesses, does not have control of all the communities, the areas in which people are living, the use of cars, the use of public transport. All of these issues, they require a lot of change, and Edinburgh Council recognized that they can't do that themselves. They've got ownership of assets like their own vehicles and their own buildings, but that's limited. It's only something like a third of the emissions for the city of Edinburgh. The other thing that's happened over the last few years is that communities are being given greater and greater responsibility for taking urban planning decisions in their local area. So this has been a very long-standing issue to enable communities to have a say when their own area is being changed and adapted, whether that's to make improved walkways, whether it's to change bus routes. Many of these things are now very much in the hands of local communities. And the idea has been to create a new document, which is a local place plan is a requirement, and that's generated by a community. So that at that point, the local community can put in place and be the primary determinant of what will change in their own areas. At the moment, there's quite a lot of new work going on around local place plans, and it's all very recent. And this is actually relates to a project that I've now trying to seek funding for. I'm working with an urban planner around trying to use this, this connection between planning reforms and climate action in communities. So we have in mind an organization which is called Communities United in Climate Action, and we're using local place plans extended with actions on the climate emergency. So rather than having these two planning activities being kept separate, our aim is to bring together local place planning activities, and when those activities are happening, incorporate issues regarding sustainability and climate change. There's clearly going to be a lot of local place plans being developed. There will be a lot of resources being made available to these communities, these neighborhoods, and this is the perfect time to start looking at the infrastructure and the way in which energy is provided, the way in which transport happens. This diagram here on the left-hand side is a tool that it's a metric that's used as a standard tool when communities are engaged with and they're looking to express what they feel are the issues for their own community. So it may be things like feeling safe, or it may be things like social contact. It may be that there's not enough facilities in the area, or it may be public transport or traffic and parking. Some of those do relate to carbon emissions, but active travel is not a specific target. So there are some clear gaps around carbon emissions, waste management, retrofits of domestic homes, putting insulation together. And we're looking to extend that kind of graph to include some of the ideas that have been put forward in the donut economics model, which it's for those who haven't not aware of this, it's an interesting approach that's been developed by a British academic, Kate Rayworth, and essentially it's looking at the limits, not just shortfalls in the areas like safety, but there could be too much use of too much carbon emission, too much pollution, too much recapture of reclamation of land. So what we're looking to do is to extend the metrics. That's one aspect of it. So develop a place and sustainability tool. The second challenge that we've got is to be working with communities, and the communities, as if one goes into the area that we're thinking to be working in, is an area on the east side of Edinburgh, where there are already a number of community groups. The community groups have got their particular concerns. Some of them relate to cycling. Some of them relate to public transport. And some of them relate to the community, just wanting to be able to better represent the community. And what we're seeing is these groups essentially act independently. When we think of the task that the Edinburgh Council has in engaging with communities, it's clearly not straightforward for the Edinburgh Council to engage with that cluster of groups who are all operating independently. So the Edinburgh Council hasn't as yet set its own, I should actually say it's the Edinburgh Climate Commission, has set some priorities, but hasn't defined the plan yet. Some of them are things like defining requirements for new houses. Some of them relate to city energy generation. These new requirements are these are the very things that they will need support from the community. And for our project, what we're looking to be able to do is create clusters of community groups that can work around shared interests. So, for example, the topic of active travel may become one that brings together 5 or 6 different groups who can then support some plans, decide upon some community actions, and also provide some way of gathering a representation that can be fed back to the council. And from the council's point of view, it can have some confidence, if this is done in a fair way, that they're dealing with a legitimate representation of the council. This is not of the community. So they're not just dealing with people that they happen to know. If we can bring the entire community together and move it into the space of the topics that the Edinburgh community, the Edinburgh Climate Commission is looking to address, then we're providing something of an interface between the community and the city. So we're looking to create action groups and form an assembly which brings together all the action groups in a community. And the aim is that they will provide a coherent interface for both the Edinburgh Climate Commission and for other partners. So here we're looking at the picture, and I'm not sure if you're able to see it, if you can read it, but here are some of the threads, and they haven't as yet been defined. But these topics, like Transport Action Group, Streets and Spaces, Buildings Action Group, Biodiversity Action Group, these all may be set up to correspond with the targets that Edinburgh City define. So the Transport Action Group may bring together 5 or 6 existing communities. The Streets and Spaces Group may bring others together. Those involved with buildings will bring those groups together. So this model on the right aims to harmonize and align the community assembly to Edinburgh Decarbonisation Plan. So that's pretty much where I wanted to get to. That's a quick view of the background, my views on climate action, my views on the opportunities and the way in which I want to engage with opportunities in Edinburgh and Scotland at the moment. And I've just covered I'm involved with 2 projects. That's one of the key ones that I'm involved with. And where do I want to go to from that? I'm looking for the pilot, which covers part of the east side of Edinburgh. I'm looking for that to be extended in the future. So looking for funding for the first project, and we're reaching out to partners to establish a capability to run that program. There's quite a few skills that I think professionals could help us with. We're looking to, once we've developed our approach, we will assess how well we've done. We'll look at the strengths of the approach that were adopted and look at the limitations and look to improve the methodology, and hopefully then be able to repeat it in other Scottish communities. So yeah, that's essentially the way in which this for me is almost an ideal project in terms of my own involvement. I engage with it through personal interest, a concern, seeing an opportunity, being involved, setting up partnerships, engaging at a bigger level, and setting up something that could potentially have greater significance than just the initial thought. And I think that's it. I think I will stop just at that point. So I'd be delighted if you've got any questions for me. I'll just move this off screen share. When I get round to working out where that is.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for giving us such a good insight into how Scotland deals with the whole situation, because obviously we are very focused on our own communities as well. And I myself am very interested in how to get more people to engage, because I feel like for a lot of people it's a bit of a black and white thinking. So they think either they have to be radical climate activists, or they're sitting at home not doing anything and not really feel involved. And I feel like this approach really takes the pressure from the individual and gives them the opportunity to empower them in their community, rather than either having the government set standards or being personally responsible. So do you think like the personal empowerment in the community itself is a big part where it could be more successful than just setting general goals?
Yes, I think what you've expressed there is exactly where I'm coming from on this. I think it's important, my own view, you will have gathered from the few slides I gave at the beginning. I'm really concerned that we haven't been meeting the sort of targets that are necessary, and I'm looking to upscale and if I thought there was some radical action that would work, I might consider it. I just don't think that that's really the way to achieve it. I think for me the most important thing is to see it as a problem that everybody is involved with. So that's at a national level, at a regional level, a state level, a council level, every business, every sports team, every group should be need to be thinking about sustainability, because we're facing a significant issue here.
So there's another question. It says, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the idea of the donut economics.
The donut economics is something that was developed.
Maybe, I'm sorry, if you go back to the slide, which is referring it to, I think you had it fairly at the beginning, the donut.
Okay, let's just see if I can. I'm so useless at moving between these things. I'm really sorry. So I presume, are you seeing a shared screen at the moment?
Yeah, I can see your screen. Yeah, okay.
Okay, let me just go back then, sorry. Okay. So essentially the person who set this up, it's a book called Donut Economics. It was set up as a way of, Kate Raworth is an economist, but rather than thinking of the economic issues as essentially purely financial, she started wanting to create additional metrics and defined a boundary level of both lower level and upper level metrics that all needed to set up a composite healthy society that all needed to be taken into account. The diagram that you're seeing there illustrates with the areas above the green line. Between the donut is the central part between what says the ecological ceiling, and below that is the social foundation. Above that are areas where there are specific issues that need to be addressed. So this is essentially a targeting, which is comparable. If you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, which is a set of topics, that is something that applies at a community level. The diagram that is put together for the donut economics is at a national level. It was created for countries to essentially make their own assessment of the issues that they're facing. We're interested in trying to scale some of these concepts down to a community level. I should say that we're not the only ones who are interested in this particular area. If you're wanting to follow up on this, have a look at Amsterdam and donut economics, because Amsterdam have a project to model the city in donut terms. I do not know what metrics that they will be putting in place. I don't know how much that they can use of the original donut dimensions, but it's essentially something that was done to provide a composite perspective incorporating climate and sustainability.
Yeah, and I think if I understand correctly, it's really founded on the idea to, it's a bit of a bottom-up idea. So for communities to engage, to have this social foundation that then helps to mitigate the other problems that are on an ecological level as well?
Yeah, so essentially what the social foundation really tends to reflect shortfalls in requirements, and typically on the sustainability, it's the exploitation and overuse of resources above the line. So the social foundation, it's on the inside, the shortfall, which is represented there.
Yeah, I have another question, and it concerns, do you think that people are hesitant in joining climate action groups, in committing to an action group, and do you see that?
I think it's mostly a matter, it's like anything. It's a voluntary action that people need to realize. They're hesitant. I think everybody's hesitant towards their time, their emotions, all these things. And there's nothing unexpected about that. I'm not sure if there's something behind the question that's if it's thought that these climate action groups are radical, or if there's something else that is socially unacceptable. Certainly, I think in the UK, I think there's I think people tend to feel they're quite middle class, these groups, and they're not as socially diverse as many people would like them to be. So if you were to say various minority groups may well feel less able to join these groups, but I'm not quite sure if there's a specific people in mind. Certainly, I agree, people are hesitant, but I don't know if there's a general reason why not, other than that people have got a limited amount of time to do things, other than when you're in lockdown because of COVID-19.
Yeah, and if you have the possibilities, the technological possibilities to interact with people from all over the world, like we're doing now. I have a question about the communities united in climate action. So who are the people in the action groups? When you say, are they like the general communities, or are they professionals that are representing the communities sort of on a panel, or?
It's primarily let me try and be clear about two different partnerships that we're looking to set up. One is we're looking to set up partnerships with groups who are involved with the methodology that we're trying to develop. So that would include people like Kate Rayworth, people like the Amsterdam group. We're interested in making contact. We've never had any engagement with them as yet, but they are professional groups who we hope to be able to learn from. And I'm not saying they will be substantial partners, but I would hope that we could cooperate. There are other groups as well. So there's groups who are urban planners and people responsible for the planning legislation, and they will be professionals. So those kinds of groups we're looking to bring into the project as partners on the project. Now, the main part, so that's the one side, and they are professionals. When we're talking about engaging with communities, these are people normally who live in the community, and either who are operating from that community. That in Scotland, there's a lot of cycling groups, and there's two very important groups. One is called Spokes, one is called Sustrans, and these are two groups who have a presence also in this area, which is called Portobello. But they're just people who have an interest in the group. These are people who live in the area, and to get involved in an action group, they may be involved with Spokes. They're just a member of Spokes. They're a member of Sustrans, or they may never be involved with any of these groups, but because they've got and interest around the topic, and the Edinburgh Climate Commission is now starting to take actions around it, they want to have their say, then I would expect people who are outside of those groups, also non-professional, just citizens, who will join. So two different types, one group professional, one group not.
Yeah, thank you. That covered my questions. I find it really interesting to see these ideas, especially because afterwards, now we're having a discussion with local politicians, and I think it would be quite interesting to ask them some sort of ideas concerning our local community, because I find these ideas really important and interesting and very innovative as well. So
there's a couple of things that come to my mind in talking to politicians, and one is that politicians need to be representing the constituency, the people who are in the area that have elected them. And my sense at the moment is politicians, certainly in Britain, have fallen behind the general population. So the general population's concerns are not being adequately picked up by politicians. And for that reason, it's useful to create a dialogue with politicians. There's a group which I mentioned, I don't know if you remember, I referred to a group called Hope for the Future, and they're actually specialize in helping communities engage with politicians and political representatives. And I'm sure if you I can pass you their contact details, and I'm sure they'd be happy to give you some time. They may or may not know your circumstances as well as you do, but there's some very general principles about the way in which they suggest you engage with politicians. Treat them as normal people. They have got their concerns. It's think of what is they like. What can you offer them? Can you give them a chance to come and cuddle babies? Well, you can't at the moment with coronavirus, but there are things that politicians always like. They like to be supported. They like to be praised. If you've got a newsletter where you say thank you very much to these are some of the general principles, and I'd be happy to pass on a contact for Hope for the Future.
Yeah, and especially to keep up the dialogue and to keep it an open dialogue without any suppositions of being like, oh, well, they're just politicians, they don't know what they're talking about. Just to keep an open mind and really to engage and have a dialogue, an open dialogue. I think that's what we are also supporting as well. Yeah. So I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you very much for your time, Howard. And wait, let's put on again. Yeah, thank you. You can see me now, not just the voiceover. So thank you very much for your time and for doing the presentation, especially for us. And I'm really interested to check up on in a few days on how you're doing, and we're keeping in touch. And yeah, with that said, thank you very much, and I will see you soon. Cheers.
And thank you. Goodbye to everybody, and keep well.
Yes, bye. Thank you.
Okay.